Friends and viewer, good day. Elizabeth Gaskell, a famous Victorian novelist, she had written a very wonderful novel, just like Tess of the D'Urberville. The name of this novel is Ruth. Ruth, this novel is published in 1853. The Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell from the Victorian time, from the Victorian era. So, Ruth is a Victorian novel written by Elizabeth Gaskell, first published in 1853. Ruth can be considered a social problem novel since it explores and critiques the suffering of a virtuous young woman after she is seduced and gives birth to an illegitimate child. It is an also example of Victorian realist novel since it focuses on relatively ordinary event in the lives of everyday people and often gives detailed description of their physical surrounding. Gaskell uses the plot to explore themes of redemption, hypocrisy, and the deep love between parents and children. This novel tells us about the Ruth. Hilton is an orphan. After the death of her parents, she begins to work as an apprentice to a dressmaker named Mrs. Mason. Ruth is very beautiful, so she's selected to attend a ball to assist with alterations of the dresses of the wealthy guest. At the ball, she catches the eye of Henry Billingham, a wealthy and spoiled young man. Billingham creates opportunities for him and Ruth to spend time together while convincing her to keep these meetings secret. One day, Mrs. Mason runs into Ruth and Billingham and becomes convinced that Ruth has begun an illicit relationship. Mrs. Mason fires Ruth and throws her out of the lodging where she has been living. Leaving Ruth completely overwhelmed, Billingham takes advantage of the situation and persuades her to come to London with him. Ruth becomes his mistress. As a woman in a sexual relationship with a man to whom she is not married, she effectively loses her reputation and respectability. Bellingham and Ruth goes to Wales together. With their relationship becomes strained as Bellingham begins to grow bored. Ruth is also subjected to a public shaming because she openly lives as Bellingham's mistress. Bellingham becomes seriously ill with a fever, and the landlady at the inn where they were staying contracts his mother. Mrs. Bellingham arrives in Wales to care for her son and is disgusted with Ruth. She blames Ruth entirely for the relationship, and as Bellingham recovers, his mother urges him to end the relationship. Bellingham and his mother leave Wales abruptly, abandon Ruth there with a sum of money. Ruth is devastated by this abandonment and even consider killing herself. However, during her time in Wales, she has struck up a friendship with a fellow traveler named Mr. Benson. Mr. Benson is an Englishman who works as a minister and lives with a physical disability that renders him somewhat frail. Mr. Benson notices Ruth's distress, pieces together what has happened with Bellingham, and takes her under his protection. What happened next that Mr. Benson has not married and lives with his sister Faith. He sends for Faith to come to Wales and she joins him there to help with Ruth. Faith, Mr. Benson and Ruth find out that Ruth is pregnant, which is very concerning as illegitimate children were subject to such to much stigma at that time. Faith and Mr. Benson came up with a plan for Ruth to come and live with them in their hometown of Eccleston. They will claim that she is a distant relation of theirs who has recently been widowed. That way Ruth and her child can remain socially respectable. They decide that Ruth will adopt a new name, Mrs. Denny, so that no one can connect her to her past life. Ruth moves to Eccleston with them and settles into a new life. Although the Benson servant Sally quickly figure out the truth and initially judges Ruth. Ruth gives birth to a son named Leonard, whom she and everyone in the Benson household love very much. And she vows always to find a good and virtuous life to the worthy of her child. Once Leonard has gotten a bit older, Ruth begins to think about how she can make an income for herself and her child. The Bensons are good friends with Bradshaw family and the wealthy and socially influential family in the town. The Bradshaw have 4 children: Richard, Jemima, and 2 much younger daughters named Mary and Elizabeth. Mr. Bradshaw has always been impressed by Ruth's calm and sweet nature and invites her to work as governess to his 2 younger daughters. Ruth enjoys a period of happiness and calm and becomes good friend with Jemima Bradshaw. Sometime later, Mr. Bradshaw becomes involved in local politics and begins working on getting a candidate named Mr. Donny elected as local member of the parliament. Ruth meets Mr. Donny and recognizes him as Bellingham. It is later explained that Bellingham changed his name to secure an inheritance from a wealthy relative. Bellingham, who made Ruth pregnant, badgers Ruth into meeting him alone, even though she tries to avoid him and asks her to resume the relationship. She refuses and holds firm even after Bellingham learns about Leonard and asks her to marry him. Ruth thinks Bellingham would be a bad influence on his son and wants to prevent them from ever meeting. Bellingham finally gives up in the face of Ruth's stubbornness. Meanwhile, Jemima Bradshaw has been vacillating over a potential marriage with her father's business partner, Mr. Farquhar. She loves Mr. Farquhar, but has some misgiving, and her hesitation and inconsistent behavior lead to Mr. Farquhar becoming interested in Ruth. Jemima becomes bitterly jealous of Ruth. One day she hears gossip about Ruth's past and realizes that Ruth is the mother of an illegitimate child. Nonetheless, Jemima does not tell anyone. However, Mr. Bradshaw eventually hears the same information and is horrified and disgusted with Ruth. He fires her immediately and cuts off his friendship with the Bensons, when he learns that they deceived him. Ruth tells Leonard that he is an illegitimate. Tell his son that he is an illegitimate son. Many of the residents of Eccleston shun her son and the Bensons. Ruth begins to work as a nurse to earn money, primarily caring for the impoverished people. Poor little Ruth. Unfortunate Ruth. Jemima and Mr. Farquhar get married and start their own family, and they are always very kind to Ruth. Richard Bradshaw is caught embezzling money, and Mr. Bradshaw is furious and deeply ashamed of his son. Even though Mr. Bradshaw wants his son sent to prison, Mr. Farquhar and Mr. Benson are more merciful and arrange for Richard to move to Scotland and find work there. A typhus epidemic breaks out in the town. Ruth heroically risks her own safety to work in her in the fever hospital, but now her courage and hard work have led to most people forgetting about her scandalous past. The local surgeon has even offered to pay for Leonard's schooling and have him work as his apprentice. By chance, Ruth hears that Mr. Donny has come to town, caught typhus, and is now very sick. She volunteered to nurse him, and he ends up recovering. But Ruth catches the disease and dies. Everyone in the town mourns for her. Mr. Bradshaw realizes that was wrong to condemn Ruth. He shows kindness to Leonard and reconcile with his Benson family. So this is the story of the unfortunate Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell novel. So just like a Tess of the Deer Burwile by Thomas Hardy, Ruth also became a very unfortunate girl who suffered and became the victim of her circumstances. The theme of this novel is parental love and protectiveness. Gaskell novel depicts several parents-child relationships, showing how these relationships can be either destructive or constructive for a child's future. A common theme displayed across these relationships is a desire for parents to protect their children from what they perceive as threat. In some cases, this can be backfire and prove harmful. Mrs. Bellingham believes that Ruth has seduced her son and might be trying to lure him into marrying her on providing her with money, mistakenly believing that Ruth is the girl whose profligacy and led her to son astray. In her cruel action toward Ruth, she operates out of misguided love for her son, but as a result, she causes great pain to Ruth and encourages her son to keep leading a self-centered and irresponsible life. Likewise, Mr. Bradshaw truly wants Jemima to be happy and is correct in noticing that she and Mr. Farquhar could be a good match. Through his meddling and his attempt to save Jemima from herself, he almost ends up ruining the relationship. Whereas if he had not interfered, Farquhar and Jemima could likely have come together on their own. More seriously, Mr. Bradshaw's strict moral severity with Richard is intended to protect the young woman, but sets Richard up to comfortably with lying and deception. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the sad story of Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell, a very super novel, a very distressing, a very sad novel. A poor child of the victim, Ruth, again became the victim of her circumstances, just like the Tess of the Deer Burwile by Thomas Hardy. Thank you very much for kind listening.